The Galactic Union didn't come to Earth with guns or bombs. They came with math. To them, every living thing was just a set of numbers. They believed that if you knew how much a creature feared death, you knew exactly how to break it. They had a machine for this, the S-meter. It was a sleek, floating silver cube that scanned the brain and measured fear response on a scale of 1 to 100. It was the ultimate weapon of the universe. Most alien species, the tall, blue-skinned warriors or the four-armed giants, would hit a 90 on that scale the moment they saw a weapon. They would cry, surrender, and give up their secrets. But then, the Union met humans. Inside a cold, white laboratory on a hidden space station, two alien scientists, Krell and Vax, were conducting their most important test. Krell was tall with scales like a lizard, while Vax was short and had four eyes that never stopped blinking. They stood behind a massive wall of reinforced glass, looking at their prize, a captured human soldier named Elias. Elias didn't look like a hero. He was tired. He had dirt on his face and a small tear in his green jacket. He was strapped to a heavy metal chair in the center of a dark room. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't begging. He just sat there, looking at his boots. "He looks weak," Vax muttered, his four eyes squinting. "His skin is soft. He has no armor, no claws. This will be over in seconds." Krell nodded, his scaly fingers hovering over a glowing control panel. "Humans are strange. They talk about courage, but science says courage is just a lie. Every heart has a breaking point. We are going to find his." The plan was simple. They weren't going to physically hurt Elias. Instead, they were going to use a high-tech holographic projection to show him the total destruction of his home. They would show him Earth burning. They would show him his family, his friends, and his entire world turning to ash. "Start the simulation," Krell whispered. Suddenly, the air in Elias's room began to shimmer. Massive 3D images appeared all around him. He saw the blue oceans of Earth boiling. He saw the tall buildings of New York and Tokyo falling into the sea. The sound of screaming, billions of voices filled the room. It was so real that even the scientist behind the glass felt a shiver of unease. Krell looked at the S-meter. "Watch the numbers," he said. The machine began to hum. A digital display on the wall showed the reading, 5, 8, 12. "It's moving slowly," Vax said, confused. "By now, any other species would be at a 70. Why is he just sitting there?" Elias wasn't looking away from the horror. He stared directly into the flames of the hologram. His face was pale. His hands were clenched into tight fists, his knuckles turning white. His heart was beating so fast that the monitors picked up the sound thump, 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 like a war drum echoing through the lab. "Increase the intensity," Krell ordered. "Show him the end of his bloodline. Show him the total extinction of his kind." The hologram grew brighter, hotter, and more terrifying. The S-meter climbed 20, 30, 45. Then, something went wrong. The S-meter didn't just jump to 90. It didn't follow the rules of biology. Instead of a steady rise, the machine began to shake. A high-pitched whine started to fill the lab. The numbers on the displays started spinning so fast they became a blur. "Wet, the sensors are overheating," Vax yelled, his four eyes wide with panic. Elias finally looked up. He wasn't looking at the fake fire anymore. He was looking directly through the glass, straight at the two scientists. His eyes weren't full of tears. They were full of something much darker. Something the aliens didn't have a word for. Suddenly, the S-meter didn't just beep, it screamed. A long, piercing electronic shriek that made the scientists cover their ears. The reinforced glass wall began to vibrate. Dust fell from the ceiling. "What is happening?" Krell shrieked. "The scale only goes to 100. Why is the machine hitting 500, 800? It's impossible!" The machine wasn't breaking because Elias was too scared. It was breaking because it couldn't understand how a creature could feel that much terror and not break. The system was crashing because it was trying to measure a fire that was turning into a bomb. With a final, deafening pop, the S-meter exploded into a cloud of black smoke. The lab plunged into red emergency lighting. Through the smoke, they saw Elias. He was still in the chair, but the metal straps were starting to groan and bend. He wasn't a prisoner anymore. He was something else. The red emergency lights pulsed like a dying heart, casting long, jagged shadows across the laboratory. Smoke from the exploded S-meter curled toward the ceiling in thick, gray ribbons. Vax, the short scientist with four eyes, was frantic. His hands flew over a backup tablet, his fingers trembling so hard he could barely type. "The machine is broken?" "It has to be broken," Vax shouted over the deafening wail of the internal alarms. "Krell, look at the data buffer." The S-meter didn't just malfunction. It hit a wall and shattered. The final reading, it jumped from a 20 straight to 999 in less than half a second. "That is not a biological possibility." Krell, the lizard-like lead scientist, didn't answer. He was frozen, his yellow eyes locked on the man behind the glass. In the center of the room, Elias sat perfectly still. To a normal observer, he looked defeated. But Krell saw the truth. Elias's breathing was no longer the shallow, panicked panting of a victim. It was deep, controlled, rhythmic. It sounded like a massive engine idling, waiting for someone to slam the gas pedal. "He isn't paralyzed," Krell muttered, his voice barely a whisper. His scales, usually a vibrant green, had turned a sickly pale white. Vax stopped looking at the screen and looked at him. Vax looked up. The holographic images of a burning Earth were still flickering, broken and distorted by the power surge. Flames danced across Elias's face, but he didn't blink. His eyes, once soft and human, had become narrow and sharp. They weren't the eyes of a prey animal looking for an exit. They were the eyes of a predator that had just spotted its target. "The S-meter measures the flight response," Krell said, his voice shaking. "In every species we have ever conquered, fear equals retreat. Fear means the brain is screaming, run, hide, give up. When the meter hits 100, the subject's nervous system usually shuts down. They faint, their hearts stop, they break." Krell stepped closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface. But this human, the machine wasn't measuring his desire to run. It was trying to calculate the sheer amount of chemical energy his body was dumping into his blood. It wasn't flight, it was fight. On Vax's tablet, a new graph began to form, pulling data from the sensors still embedded in Elias's chair. "My gods," Vax gasped. His adrenaline levels, they are off the charts. His heart is pumping at a rate that should be tearing his arteries apart. His muscles are gorged with oxygen. His brain is firing electrical signals so fast it's creating a localized magnetic field. He's not sitting there because he's trapped, Krell. He's sitting there because his body is building up a charge like a massive capacitor. In the human world, they called it hysterical strength. It was the legendary power that allowed mothers to lift cars off their children or soldiers to walk on broken legs. It was a glitch in the human design, God mode, triggered by absolute terror. Elias finally moved his head. It was a slow, creaking motion. He looked at the thick, reinforced glass, the same glass that could stop a laser blast. He didn't see a wall. He saw a nuisance. "Level 500 should cause total brain death," Krell whispered, his terror growing. "At level 999, his blood should be boiling. Why is he still looking at us? Why is he smiling?" It was a tiny, grim tilt of the lips. It wasn't a smile of joy, it was a smile of recognition. Elias knew exactly what they were doing. He knew they were watching, and he knew that they were now the ones who were afraid. "Vax," Krell said, his voice suddenly cold and dead. "Release the gas. Put him to sleep." "Nah, I can't," Vax cried, tapping the tablet furiously. The S-meter explosion fried the environmental controls. "The doors are locked. The vents are sealed. We are stuck in here with him." Elias's fist clenched. The heavy steel armrest of the chair began to groan. The metal, an inch thick and designed to hold a space beast, started to warp and twist like it was made of wet cardboard. "He's not afraid of what we showed him," Krell realized, a cold dread sinking into his gut. "He's afraid for his world. And for a human, that kind of fear doesn't make them weak. It makes them gods of destruction. We didn't find their breaking point, Vax. We found their trigger." A loud Sirac echoed through the room. A bolt from the chair flew off and embedded itself in the far wall. Elias stood up, the broken metal straps hanging from his arms like tattered ribbons. He turned toward the observation window, and for the first time, the scientists realized the S-meter hadn't broken because of a glitch. It had broken because it ran out of numbers to describe what was about to happen to them. The air in the observation deck was thick with the smell of ozone and melting plastic. It was a sharp, stinging scent that made Vax's eyes water. The S-meter, once a marvel of alien engineering, was now a smoking ruin on the floor. Its cooling fans had shrieked at 1,000,000 rotations per minute before the motor finally gave up, sending a shower of orange sparks across the room. It wasn't just a spike in his heart rate, Krell whispered, his voice cracking. He was looking at the last recorded data on a flickering wall monitor. The machine crashed because it reached a mathematical paradox. It was trying to calculate a value that doesn't exist in our physics. To the Galactic Union, fear was like a brake pedal. When a creature felt fear, its brain sent signals to stop, to shrink, to hide. It was a survival mechanism that kept you alive by making you small. But as Krell watched the silhouette of the human moving in the dim red light, he realized humanity had a different blueprint. For Elias, fear wasn't a brake pedal. It was a supercharger. Every image of his burning home, every scream of a simulated child, and every flash of the Union's warships hadn't pushed him toward surrender. Instead, those images had acted like a spark in a fuel tank. His body was currently a chemical factory working at 400% capacity. His liver was dumping glucose into his bloodstream. His pupils were so dilated they were almost entirely black, absorbing every photon of light in the dark room. "Look at his hands," Vax breathed, pointing a trembling finger at the monitor. The high-definition cameras, still barely functioning, showed Elias's fingers. He wasn't shaking with terror. He was gripping the edge of the metal table so hard that his fingernails were drawing blood from his own palms, and he didn't even seem to notice. He was preparing his body to endure agony just for a chance to strike back. He was ready to break his own bones if it meant breaking his enemy's neck. Suddenly, the central computer began to groan. A deep, synthesized voice echoed through the lobby. The digital display on the wall, which usually showed neat rows of alien symbols, began to glitch violently. The numbers turned into jagged shapes, then into static. The words RR, OVRO, LAM-ITXEDID flashed in a blinding strobe light. "The S-meter is linked to the station's main AI," Krell shouted, grabbing Vax by the shoulder. "The AI is trying to model the human's psychological state to predict his next move, but it can't. It's trying to find the surrender point, but the human's defiance is growing exponentially with his fear." It was a feedback loop. The more the aliens tried to scare him, the stronger Elias became. The stronger Elias became, the more the AI calculated him as a threat. The more the AI saw him as a threat, the more security measures it activated, which only served to make Elias even more furious. "Shut it down," Krell yelled. "The system is going to blow." But it was too late. The station's computer was built on logic, and there was no logic in what Elias was doing. There was no logic in a single, unarmed male standing up against a galactic empire. The computer reached the end of its programming and simply gave up. With a sound like a lightning strike, the main power coupling in the room snapped. A massive blue arc of electricity jumped from the ceiling to the S-meter's pedestal. The glass of the display screens shattered simultaneously, sending glass shards flying like diamonds through the air. Then total, suffocating darkness. The only sound was the heavy, wet thud of the S-meter's remains hitting the floor and the distant, rhythmic clanging of a manual alarm bell. "Vax, can you hear me?" Krell asked into the blackness. He reached out, his scales shivering. He felt the cold metal of the control desk. "I'm here," Vax whimpered. "The power is out. The entire sector is dark. Even the electronic locks on the doors." Vax stopped talking. He realized what he was about to say. "The locks," Krell repeated, his heart skipping a beat. "If the power is out, the electromagnetic seals on the human's chamber." From the other side of the thick glass, they heard a sound that made their blood turn to ice. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a cry for help. It was the sound of a heavy, pressurized door being slid open by hand. Scree-leech. The metal-on-metal sound set their teeth on edge. Elias was out of his chair. He was out of his restraints. And now, there was nothing but a piece of cracked glass between the weak human and the two scientists who had tried to measure his soul. Krell looked toward the glass. In the faint, shimmering glow of the dying sparks, he saw two eyes reflecting the light. They weren't the eyes of a test subject. They were the eyes of a ghost coming for revenge. The darkness in the laboratory wasn't just the absence of light. It felt heavy, like a thick blanket draped over the two scientists. For the first time in their lives, Krell and Vax were experiencing what the S-meter was designed to measure. Their hearts were hammering against their ribs. Their skin felt cold and clammy. They were Level 10 creatures. In the Galactic Union, most species had evolved in peaceful environments where food was plenty and predators were extinct. They had forgotten what it felt like to be hunted. They had forgotten that the dark wasn't just empty space, it was a hiding place. Clang, clang, the sound echoed through the room. It was rhythmic and terrifying. It was the sound of Elias, the weak human pulling the high tensile steel bolts out of the floor with his bare hands. He wasn't using tools. He was using the raw, unfiltered power of his own muscles, fueled by a level of adrenaline that should have been lethal. "We need to calibrate the backup system," Vax hissed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeal. He fumbled in the dark, his four hands slapping against the cold metal of the control desk. He was looking for a button, a switch, anything to turn the lights back on. "If we can just reset the S-meter, we can regain control." "There is no backup for this, Vax," Krell replied, his voice surprisingly calm, though his scales were shivering so hard they made a dry, rattling sound. The system didn't break because of a software glitch. It broke because it tried to measure a sun with a thermometer. We were trying to quantify a force of nature that doesn't follow our laws of math. Thump. The sound of Elias's feet hitting the floor told them he was no longer in the chair. He was moving. In the silence, the scientists could hear him breathing. It wasn't the gasping breath of a man in pain. It was slow, deep, and focused. To the aliens, every breath Elias took sounded like a predator tasting the air. They realized that while they were blind in the dark, the human had spent his entire history fighting in the shadows. His ancestors had hunted mammoths in the snow and fought wars in the mud. To him, the dark was an old friend. "I can hear his heart," Vax whispered, his 4 eyes wide and useless in the pitch black. "It sounds like a drum, a war drum." "He's tracking us," Krell whispered back. "He doesn't need his eyes. He can hear our hearts. He can smell our fear." Suddenly, a faint orange glow appeared. It wasn't a light, it was the tiny, dying embers from the exploded S-meter on the floor. In that dim, flickering light, they saw a shadow move across the glass. It was tall, broad, and moving with a terrifying grace. Elias wasn't stumbling in the dark. He was prowling. He walked right up to the observation glass. The scientists couldn't see his face clearly, but they could see the outline of his head. He leaned in close, until his forehead was almost touching the reinforced pane that separated the lab from the observation deck. Tap, tap, tap. Elias knocked on the glass with a single knuckle. It was a simple, casual sound, but to the scientists it sounded like a death knell. He knew exactly where they were. The glass, which was supposed to be a one-way mirror, was no longer a shield. It was a window into their own doom. "Hey, he's looking at us," Vax whimpered. "No," Krell said, a realization hitting him that was more terrifying than the dark itself. "He's not looking at us. He's looking through us. He's already decided we are no longer a threat. He's looking at the door behind us. He's looking at the rest of the station." Krell realized that they had made a mistake that would haunt the Galactic Union for centuries. They thought fear was a way to control someone. They thought that by showing a human the end of the world, they would make him small. But for a human, when you take away everything they love, their home, their family, their future, you don't make them a slave. You make them a monster with nothing left to lose. Elias placed his palm against the glass. The heat from his hand left a faint mist on the surface. Slowly, he began to push. The reinforced glass, built to withstand the vacuum of space, began to moan. A tiny spider web crack appeared right under his thumb. "The hunters are gone, Vax," Krell whispered as the crack began to spread across the window. "We are just the meat." The emergency red lights finally stabilized, bathing the laboratory in a thick, bloody glow. The flickering had stopped, but the silence that followed was much worse. Elias stood directly in front of the cracked observation glass. He wasn't breathing hard anymore. He stood perfectly still, his silhouette tall and jagged against the red light. He didn't look like a prisoner. He didn't even look like a soldier. He looked like an ancient force of nature that had been woken up by mistake. He slowly raised a bruised, blood-stained hand and pressed his palm against the glass. The spiderweb cracks groaned under his touch. Then he leaned forward until his lips were almost touching the speaker grill. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated through the scientist's very bones. "You measured my fear," Elias said, his eyes burning with a terrifying clarity. "But you forgot to measure my spite." Vax fell back into his chair, his 4 hands clutching his head. Krell just stood there, paralyzed. They finally understood. Their S-meter was designed to measure flight, the urge to run away from danger. But humans had a biological glitch. When a human feels a level of fear that would kill any other creature, they don't always run. Sometimes they get angry. They get spiteful. They decide that if they are going to die, they are going to make sure their enemy dies first. We thought fear was a weakness. Krell whispered to himself. We thought it was the white flag of surrender. But for them, fear is the trigger for the counterattack. Elias didn't wait for a response. With one final, massive heave of his shoulder, he shattered the reinforced glass. Shards of the heavy material rained down on the laboratory floor like frozen tears. He stepped through the jagged frame and into the observation room. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need one. His presence alone filled the room like a physical weight. Vax began to sob, a strange, clicking sound. "Please, we were just following orders." "We just wanted to understand." Elias looked at the small, trembling alien. He didn't strike him. Instead, he walked over to the main communication console. His movements were calm, which was somehow scarier than if he had been screaming. He tapped a few buttons, overriding the station's lock, down using the codes the AI had accidentally leaked during its crash. "Open a channel," Elias commanded. "Broadcast to your high command. Now." Krell's hands shook as he opened the subspace frequency. A holographic projection of the Galactic Union's general appeared. The general was a massive, armored being who had conquered 100 worlds. He looked at the scene, the broken lab, the smoking machines, and the lone, bloodied human standing over his top scientists. "What is the meaning of this?" The general roared. Report the fear levels. Is the planet ready for harvest? Elias stepped into the light of the hologram. He didn't look at the general with hatred. He looked at him with a cold, terrifying boredom. Your machines couldn't count high enough to measure us, Elias said. Go ahead. Send your fleet. But know this, every person on my planet is feeling exactly what I'm feeling right now. We are terrified. And because we are terrified, we are going to burn every ship you send into the atmosphere. We will fight you in the streets, in the dirt, and in the dark. We will break our own hands just to dent your armor. The general stared at the data feed flickering behind Elias. He saw the 999 error code. He saw the chemical readings of a body that was essentially running on rocket fuel and pure will. For the first time in the history of the Union, a general felt a level 10 fear response. He didn't see a species to be conquered. He saw a species that would turn the entire galaxy into a graveyard before they ever said, I surrender. Cancel the invasion. The general whispered. Sir, his advisors gasped. But the resources? Cancel it? The general barked. We didn't find a new territory. We found a predator that enjoys being backed into a corner. I will not lead my empire into a war against a species that uses terror as a weapon against itself. The transmission cut to black. Elias stood in the silent lab for a long time. The adrenaline was finally leaving his system, and his body began to ache. He slumped against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor. He looked at Krell and Vax, who were huddled in the corner. Go, Elias said quietly. Get your ship. Go home. Tell them to stay away from the blue dot. The scientists didn't need to be told twice. They ran. They left the station, they left the sector, and they eventually left that part of the galaxy entirely. Years later, the human file in the Galactic Library was updated with a single warning note. Do not measure them. Do not threaten them. And above all, never ever make them afraid. Because when a human is afraid, the universe breaks.